Right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think everybody, or most people are here, and in the next few minutes, I dare say more people will be joining us. My name's Bill Gibson. I'm, together with Jordan, one of the editors of this lovely thing, which is in honour of Peter's retirement, really, but in honour of his scholarship. I just want to say a few words about what's going to happen this afternoon. We're going to have contributions. Sort of brief 5-minute contributions from Bill Simpson, Jay Stewart, Nigel Aston, Carol Blessing, and Jeremy Gregory, as well as Peter having a moment to talk to us. But Jordan and I wanted to kick off by just saying a little bit about how we got to know Peter and in particular what his work has meant to us. What I should say is that like a number of people here, I suspect, I got to know Peter rather sort of in a rather crab-like way, because from the 1980s onwards, it was possible to see references to a rather wonderful DPhil that had been examined in Oxford in the 1980s. But it took, of course, almost, well, I think a decade for this work to appear, the Oxford Movement in Context. But it absolutely revolutionized our view of the 18th century. Suddenly, all of those high churchmen that we thought had disappeared or hadn't existed came out of the woodwork, and it was Peter's work that tickled them out of the woodwork and presented them to us. And we all suddenly had a sense that high churchmanship was still alive and well in the 18th century and hadn't died off with non-jurors. So part of my understanding and connection with Peter was through that fabulous book. But more recently, from 2007, Peter's been on the advisory committee of the centre which I'm the director of, the Oxford Centre for Methodism and Church History at Oxford Brookes. And in that capacity, Peter's been absolutely splendid. He's come along to meetings. In fact, I think, Peter, you get the cup for attending most meetings consistently. And certainly in terms of your support and guidance, both for the centre and for scholars, it's been a fantastic thing, and I'm very grateful to you for all the help and support you've given us. So let me now hand over to Jordan.
Okay, thanks very much, Bill. Well, my greetings and warm welcome to you all. A very brief introduction, as not all of you know who I am. I'm director of the Manchester Wesley Research Centre and senior lecturer in church history and Wesley studies at Nazarene Theological College here in Manchester in the UK. Well, I've known Peter now for 18 years, since 2003, when I arrived at the University of Manchester as a doctoral student. And I arrived to work in the Methodist Archives and Research Centre at the John Rylands Library on John Wesley and early Methodism, with Jeremy Gregory as my supervisor, and Peter was my second supervisor. Now, I was pleased to discover that Peter fit some of the images that I had in my mind of a traditional British scholar librarian. But what was most important and what was immediately apparent to me, and what I've really always appreciated about Peter, is his friendliness and that he's eminently approachable. He was clearly genuinely interested in my research and enthusiastic about supporting it. And it's really this same generous pattern that I've seen repeated over and over again with scholars that Peter has interacted with. I completed my doctoral studies in 2008, and a revision of the thesis was published by Oxford University Press as John Wesley in America, Restoring Primitive Christianity. And since then, I've consistently kept in touch with Peter, aided by the fact that we were neighbors for 7 years in Didsbury, here in South Manchester. And it's a joy to me that we even went on to co-supervise a University of Manchester Nazarene Theological College PhD thesis together. So then how did this Festschrift for Peter come about? Well, it dates back almost 4 years to the autumn of 2017, when Professor William Gibson and I discussed the idea, and we enthusiastically decided to work on this project together. publishing the Festschrift as a special edition of the Bulletin of the John Rylands Library was the obvious first port of call. And we're grateful that our proposal was accepted by Bulletin editors Stephen Mossman and Cordelia Ware. And we've appreciated working with them and others at Manchester University Press. In some ways, the biggest problem for us was choosing a dozen scholars, friends of Peter, to contribute to the volume. Now, as many of you know, and as you might imagine, given Peter's vast scholarly networks, the list of potential contributors we drew up was enormous. Nonetheless, we trust that the book is a fitting tribute to Peter's scholarship and friendship. It has articles on a range of topics relating to the Church of England, particularly high churchmanship and the Oxford movement, Catholicism, Methodism, and even church-state conflict in the Church of Ireland. So we think the volume can be considered broadly representative of Peter's scholarship and his scholarly networks. Now I'll turn it over to Bill again to kind of give a brief summary of the book.
Thanks, Jordan. Others today are going to talk a little bit about the book, so I won't talk in much detail about it, other than to reiterate, as Jordan said, we could have had many contributors. I think our initial list ran to 2 or 3 pages at the very least of single type of people who we thought we could approach, and I'm sure would have contributed. What I like about the book particularly is that it, as Jordan said, it covers the kind of range of things that Peter's been involved with, both as a scholar and in his work as a professional librarian. And the other thing which I think is rather wonderful is that many of the contributors are not just people who work in the same field as Peter, but also, like Jordan and I, are friends of Peter and who value his friendship very much. So as a collaboration of fellow scholars and friends, it was a great thing to do. And actually, I'm one of the people who often forsworn doing another collection of essays, but this one really was a great pleasure to do, because everybody, I think, had a sense that they were working to thank Peter for his scholarship for over the time that he's been active in research and librarianship. Now, I think we turn over to our first contributor, and I think, Jordan, you're going to introduce Bill Simpson.
Yes, and as a kind of segue to doing that, I will just briefly share with you the discount code from Manchester University Press if you want to get a hold of the copy of the book. You probably have this in the email that you received that gave you the Zoom link for this session, so you can go back to that. But the discount code, if you want to write it down now, you should be able to see that on your screen. It's BJRL 2021, okay? And that will give you a 50% discount, lowering the book to £16.25, I think, so quite a bargain. And be sure to use it soon, though. It expires on the 12th of June, in about a week, so use it before the 12th of June. I have used it today, so I can confirm that it does work. So encourage you, if you're interested in that, to get a copy of the book. So yes, now I have the pleasure of introducing Bill Simpson. And Bill worked in the University of Manchester Library with Peter from the time Peter arrived there in 1979 to the mid-1980s. And then again, when he was university librarian and director of the John Rylands Library from 2002 to 2007. So Bill is going to share with us about Peter, the librarian.
Apologies for that. Yeah. I'm going to speak briefly about Peter's library career. Although it is perhaps less spectacular than his academic career, it is nevertheless just as valuable in many other ways. As Jordan has said, I've known Peter since 1979, when he joined the staff of the John Rylands University Library of Manchester, as it then was. And he was already then showing signs of becoming a scholar librarian, which I think is something to be hugely appreciated and recognized. It probably helped him get the job, because Fred Radcliffe, who was then the university librarian, valued scholarly expertise above mere library training, as he would have put it, feeling that the expertise was more valuable in the long term and the training could be acquired on the job. Nevertheless, poor Peter had to go through the mill of being trained as a librarian. This included stints in the cataloguing room of the old building at the foot of Lime Grove, which was grossly overcrowded, full of books, full of people. And nevertheless, despite this, it produced both distinguished scholars and people who went on to become university librarians themselves. It was presided over by a diminutive Yorkshireman who was also very affable and very eccentric, named Dr. George Johnson. And George would periodically emerge from his office waving a catalogue entry. There were cards in those days, long before computer cataloguing, and shouting, "I found a funny." And when that happened, you kept your head down, as I'm sure Peter remembers well. The work also involved spending some time on the main circulation counter, which was something of a test for people with an academic background, because it involved not just issuing and returning books, but also shelving, which was physically demanding. And it left you always with a great appreciation for the efforts and stamina of the regular counter staff. The big fear was always that you would drop the charge. This was the collection of loan slips used in those days, containing hundreds of pieces of paper, because you knew if you dropped it, you'd spend hours picking up the pieces and refiling them afterwards. Nevertheless, Peter came through this with his characteristic good humor and his sanity intact and returned to cataloguing. All this changed in 1982 with the move into the new main library at the foot of Burlington Street, into much more spacious and welcoming accommodation than Peter had known before. At that point, he came into my own orbit for the first time directly, because as head of reader services at the time, I was responsible for arranging that information services be delivered effectively. And this included staffing things like information desks, where I was involved in putting Peter on rotas, observing his progress, ensuring he did the job properly. I was always deeply impressed by the feedback I got, by the fact that I always had positive comments, by his calmness under pressure, grace under fire, as one puts it, and the fact that he always seemed to manage to find the answer wherever it was and however you found it, he got there. I left Manchester in 1985 to become university librarian elsewhere, and I lost track of Peter's career for 17 years, really, between then and 2002, when I returned to Manchester. But I know at that time that his career took off both as a scholar and as a librarian. He moved to the Rylands Library from the main library in 1990 with responsibility for the Methodist collections and for rare books and maps. And subsequently took responsibility also for the theological book collections. I remember him particularly too for his work with me for a time on the committee of the Christian Brethren Archive, where I was always impressed by his commitment, his courtesy, and his expertise. He is truly a polymath when it comes to religious studies and the history of religion. As university librarian, I came to appreciate Peter and his contribution more and more. I saw the expertise he had, both as a scholar and as a human being, as I saw the support he gave to researchers, whether they were established researchers such as yourselves, or whether they were students just beginning to work towards high degrees. I heard many positive comments, appreciative feedback, and it was clear to me at all times how valuable Peter's services were, both to the Rylands and to the university. Peter's being honoured, and rightly so today, for his academic contribution, but I would also like to pay respect to him for his significant achievements as a librarian. They may be less well recorded than his scholarly achievements, but they're no less significant. He contributed a huge amount, both to the work of the university and the wider academic community, to the reputation and esteem in which the Rylands itself as a library and as an institution are held. And for those reasons, and in addition to which, the fact was that being a busy librarian didn't stop him from being a distinguished scholar. I'm astonished at just how much work he achieved, how much he published at a time when he was also busy helping and supporting other people. So I think it's my job today not to talk so much about his academic achievement, but about his library achievement. And as former university librarian, I think perhaps it's appropriate that I should express, wearing my former incarnation, the thanks of the Rylands itself, of the library as a whole, and of the University of Manchester for all that Peter has done to enhance its reputation for scholarship, for courtesy, for commitment, and for general helpfulness to all who came and needed that help. Well done, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, very much indeed. Our next speaker is Jay Brown, who is a contributor to the volume. Jay's essay is Dissolving the Sacred Union, the Disestablishment of the Church in Ireland. And Jay's going to say a few words. Jay, I should mention, is Professor of Ecclesiastical History at the University of Edinburgh. And Jay's going to say a few words about Peter as a scholar. Jay.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you, Bill. We've just been actually celebrating the 175th anniversary of the laying of the foundation stone of New College today. So I've had to organize a conference earlier today. Well, it's an honor to be asked to say a few words about the scholarship of my good friend, Peter Nockles. I've admired and benefited from his scholarly work for some 3 decades, and we've co-edited 2 major volumes on the Oxford movement, one of them with Father James Pirro, who I think may be with us today. Peter's great scholarly achievement, and it has been a great achievement, finds expression, as Bill was saying, in the title of his first book, The Oxford Movement in Context. Through his extensive writings, he's explored with deep learning and analytical power the Oxford movement within its broad intellectual, theological, devotional, and cultural context. He's demonstrated that the Oxford movement that emerged at Oriel College in the early 1830s must be viewed as part of a much larger movement of religious renewal, which drew on influences from a number of 18th century strands, among them High Church Anglicanism, but also evangelicalism. He's shown how the Oxford movement drew on a rich legacy of theological and devotional writings, and then energized those ideas and beliefs for a generation influenced by Romanticism and idealism, and formed a religious renewal movement that helped to shape the 19th century English-speaking world. His work has included innovative studies of the Oxford movement in Scotland, in Ireland, in the United States. His knowledge of the Anglican Church before, during, and after the Oxford movement is prodigious. No one can understand the Oxford movement or modern Anglicanism without engaging with his scholarship. And secondly, he's shown that religion played a vital role in Western, especially British, social, intellectual, and cultural life throughout the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. Now, this is important. When Peter and I were beginning our scholarly careers, historical interpretations were dominated by a general secularization narrative, which included emphasis on social contract discourse and anti-religious enlightenment, the rise of science, the Victorian crisis of faith, and working class irreligion. Religion was also often dismissed as either intellectually obscurantist or as a form of social control. I certainly encountered such attitudes in my own early work on the Scottish religious enlightenment and Thomas Chalmers. What Peter's work helped to do was to bring to light the rich theological and devotional writings of the 18th and early 19th centuries to demonstrate their intellectual power and to show that the Christian tradition remained part of the cultural mainstream. Now, he wasn't alone in this, and his work was part of a larger movement of historians, including Jonathan Clark, David Bebbington, Jeremy Gregory, Nigel Aston, Boyd Hilton, Jeremy Morris, Francis Knight, Bill Gibson, Arthur Burns, Hugh MacLeod, James Spiro, and many others. But Peter's voice has been a powerful and an eloquent one. And finally, Peter is a scholar of immense generosity, who's given his support to many other scholars. Most of us can recall Peter's acts of support and kindness. For many years, he organized the academic conferences of the Catholic Record Society, and he regularly attends academic conferences, various societies, giving papers, participating in discussions, and often, very often, having quiet, encouraging conversations with early career scholars. He is a master of the review article or historiographical essay, critically analyzing and synthesizing a broad range of scholarship on, say, John Henry Newman or the Oxford Movement, or most recently, Alexander Knox. Thank you, Peter. One of my favorites is his essay on the histories and anti-histories of the Oxford Movement in the Oxford Handbook of the Oxford Movement. Peter is always generous to honest scholarship, but he has little time for what he perceives as polemic or trendy interpretations. And he has a sound sense of what will prove lasting. He writes beautifully, with a clear, crisp prose style and an empathy for his historical actors. Well, I should close now. I really won't have time to refer to his expertise on meteorology and how he once explained to me why Scottish weather in July is and must be largely miserable. I suppose you might say he could have named any month, but suffice it to say in closing, Peter, that we're deeply grateful for your scholarly contributions, and long may those contributions continue. Thank you.
Jay, thank you very much indeed. Now we have two contributions from people talking a little bit about the book, beginning with Nigel Aston. Many of you will know that Nigel is, or was until recently, Reader in History at the University of Leicester, and was this year's Wesley Lecturer, whose lecture can be found on the Oxford Centre for Methodism and Church History's YouTube channel. So if you go onto YouTube and put in Nigel Aston, up comes his Wesley lecture. But he's talking briefly today about the book. So Nigel, over to you.
Thanks very much, Bill, and hello, Peter. Hello, friends and colleagues. Well, I was very glad that that as Bill has explained, I managed to escape the cut of potential contributors to the volume, because I was really keen to offer something to Peter as a mark of recognition for his own scholarly ascendancy, but also for a terrific friendship over the last 3 decades, which is still in a very healthy state, I think. Yeah, so I think turning to the religion in Britain, I think what's very impressive about this in the first instance is its sheer range. The way in which it bears testimony to Peter's ample reach into so many areas of scholarship, from the non-jurors right down to the end of the 19th century and arguably beyond. So I think Bill and Jordan chose and trod very carefully in selecting individuals who were able to bear witness to that range. And I think once selected, we all did a pretty effective job in keeping quiet about it, because Peter's ability to suss out what's happening on the academic grapevine is very, very good too. So I think we all deserve a pat on the back for keeping stum about it for so long. I was particularly pleased to be able to offer something on high churchmanship and its relationship to the Oxford movement in the person of Thomas Townsend, because Peter, of course, is Janus face. He's looking backwards and forwards when it comes to the Oxford movement. And Townsend I found to be a case study in the limits of the transmissibility of Georgian high churchmanship into the 19th century. And Peter has put beyond doubt, I think we'd all agree, a kind of, that there is in one sense a hermeneutic of continuity in Tractarianism, but there's a rupture and innovation in another. And the way in which I tried to present Townsend was also to bear witness to Peter's spotlight of that twin dimension of Tractarianism. I thought it was very interesting that Thomas Townsend had his biography written by Ralph Churton and Edward Churton for much of the 19th century, living in a relatively obscure Yorkshire parish, and yet deeply connected to and interested in what was happening in the Oxford movement. Here was somebody who was a moderate that regretted that people like Townsend had been left, and his ilk had been left behind by the Tractarian Advance Party. So that was the appeal of Townsend. On a personal note too, I mean, I've written quite a bit about Hutchinsonianism, and I was really quite relieved and pleased that I managed to get away from that for once. And who knows, I may never return to it, though people like Peter will draw us back, of course. That's all I really want to say about the volume, which I hope Peter feels does ample justice to all the historical illumination that he has given us all. But in 2 or 3 minutes, I just want to note just how much his friendship and comradeship has meant to me over the years, as not just to me, but also to my wife and all my family. We are very good buddies, and as a walker and weather forecaster, Peter is up there with the best, I think. I also take particular pleasure, as I think so many of us do, in his generous but also mischievous sense of humour. He can be our first port of call when we want to find out what's really happening in the world. And I better not say any more than that. One of his surprising talents, which I discovered on holiday with other friends in Herefordshire a couple of years ago, was that he's actually a really pretty good and nifty footballer. If you sort of chuck a ball onto a grassy patch and you get 5 other aging ex-five-a-siders playing, Peter is a very efficient dribbler. He's up there with the best of, if you like, we senior soccer players. So that was something I don't think did find utterance in religion in Britain, but Peter is not to be underestimated when the ball is at his feet, both in footballing terms and I think in scholarship. So Peter, I'm looking forward to having a serious drink with you at some point when we can meet non-virtually. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Nigel. That's certainly a new revelation to me. So thanks for sharing that. And I'll have to bring a football next time I go over to the green where Peter lives, not far from where I am. So now, virtually at least, we're going to move from the UK over 5,000 miles west to sunny San Diego, California, where it's still pretty early in the morning. And I have the pleasure to introduce another friend of Peter's and myself, Carol Blessing, who is Professor Emeritus of Literature and Women's Studies at Point Loma Nazarene University in San Diego. Since 2005, Carol has spent time at the Rylands Library on 4 occasions as a visiting research fellow of the Manchester Wesley Research Centre, working especially on women in the circle of the 18th century Anglican Methodists, John and Mary Fletcher in Madeley, Shropshire. Carol, I invite you to share with us about the book, your research, and Peter. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Jordan, and good morning, afternoon, and or evening, depending on where you are. I am so deeply honored to be included in this volume and to be included in this event today. So thank you so much, Jordan Hammond and Bill Gibson, for thinking of me here. When I think of Dr. Peter Nockles, one phrase comes to mind. Care to go for coffee? I am thankful that in 2005, when arriving in Manchester in the John Rylands Library for the first time, there was a kind welcome from such a distinguished scholar and librarian. And I have to say, the word that most describes Peter to me is simple, one but true, and it is the word kind. I received a Wesley Center grant from Point Loma Nazarene University for research on my nascent project, Women in the Wesleyan Tradition. I know that's a very broad title. Though I was a literature professor who primarily taught medieval and early modern English literature, a Shakespearean, I was also a women's studies professor whose work from graduate school onward had focused on the history and representation of women, primarily using archival materials from the British and Huntington libraries in San Marino, California. I also integrated religious studies, which was so central in the older literature that I taught, with the literary studies. When my spouse and I moved to Southern California from Pennsylvania, leaving our United Methodist Church, we joined the Church of the Nazarene, in large part because of its progressive history of also ordaining women from its inception. However, in the early 1990s, when I was hired at PLNU, Point Loma Nazarene University, I found that the number of female pastors, particularly in head leadership, was greatly diminished. In addition, chapel at our college rarely had female speakers, and a general anti-feminist ideology shaped many or most of my students' views. I wondered how we had gotten to this point. So starting in 1996, I worked with secondary materials on women's history in the church to see where we had come from and where and how we had progressed and backslidden. In 2004, I applied for a grant to visit the principal repository of historical knowledge of women connected to John Wesley's teaching and ethos, and ventured to the World Methodist Archives, the font of Wesleyan history, with the support of Dr. Maxine Walker, founder and head of the PLNU Wesleyan Center. Once there, with exceeding patience, again, probably frustrated with a literature person trying to enter the realm of religious history, Peter Nockles and Gareth Lloyd introduced me to the Fletcher Tooth Collection, rich archive of letters, journals, and sermons, primarily written by two women whom I came to know intimately through my time there, starting from summer 2005 and many subsequent visits. And I think it was more than 4 visits, I can't remember, and partially responsible for my weakening eyesight from all the transcriptions of their manuscripts that I did. Time in the archives was never lonely, as Peter would check on me frequently to see how I was doing, and of course, see if I wanted to get coffee in the Rylands Small Cafe. Several times, my colleague, who is here also this morning, Professor Charlene Pate, joined me on my trip. We will both enjoy Peter's hospitality and conviviality, sometimes dining with him in the city center or in Didsbury. The professors, including Dr. Peter Ray and Dr. Jordan Hammond, staff, and some graduate students from the Nazarene Theological College also gave of their time and hospitality more than I can ever remunerate or repay, including hosting me as the first visiting scholar through their Wesleyan Center. From the research I conducted in the collections overseen by Peter, I have been able to publish 3 essays, as well as present several papers in the UK and the US. My essay in this collection, Disappearing Women, The Gendered Politics of Publication of Mary Fletcher's Autobiography, also incorporates letters from the Reverend Henry Moore and his wife, as I work to unravel the complex publication process and history of the life of Mary Bosanquet Fletcher, and discovered a lengthy, unabridged apologia for women's preaching written by Mary Bosanquet and transcribed by Mary Tooth, a much more detailed and supported document than the small segment in Mary Fletcher's official biography or in letters of John Wesley, and not heretofore published as transcribed from its original. Mary Tooth proved a strong advocate for inclusion of the unexpurgated version, as well as other materials, but Henry Moore trimmed and toned down Mary Fletcher's more unorthodox ideas and radical feminism. The work, which began as Mary Fletcher's autobiography, turned into Henry Moore's biography of her. Only consultation with the archives and the help of Gareth and Peter, only through consultation with the archives and help of Gareth and Peter would I have been able to do this work. And I hope to publish more essays based on all my multitudinous research notes and photos of manuscripts generated from my time in the John Rylands Library. Most of all, though, I want to thank Peter for being a kind, humble, hospitable, and brilliant mentor, librarian, and friend. And I hope retirement allows you to travel everywhere you wish, including returning to San Diego to visit us in the near future. God's blessings on you.
Well, thank you very much, Carol, for that fitting tribute. We'll now turn to our last speaker before giving Peter himself an opportunity to say a few words. This person has known Peter for a very long time. So I'm pleased to be able to introduce to you Jeremy Gregory, who is Pro-Vice Chancellor, Faculty of Arts, and Professor of the History of Christianity at the University of Nottingham. He was formerly Professor of the History of Christianity at the University of Manchester, where he was on faculty from 2000 to 2015. And during that time, he, of course, worked closely with Peter, and his relationship with Peter goes even further back to his time at the University of Oxford in the 1980s. So Jeremy is going to give us a short review of the book. Thanks, Jeremy.
Okay, thanks very much, Jordan. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you all. It's like, a real reunion. It's brilliant. So I was delighted to be asked by Bill and Jordan to give a short verbal review of religion in Britain. And you'll be pleased to hear that this is a fine and stimulating collection of essays. Now, if I hadn't begun like that, he would have derailed the evening, but it really is fantastic. And those essays often explore individuals' religious lives to shed light on broader issues. Considered together, these essays take as their starting point, as we've already discussed, sometimes explicitly and other times implicitly, Peter's seminal The Oxford Movement in Context, Anglican High Churchmanship, 1760 to 1857, published in 1994, as well as engaging with his later research interests. In part then, this collection can be read as an extended dialogue with, footnote to, or gloss on Peter's work, sometimes adding more details to figures who Peter brought to life both in that book and elsewhere. In this latter category are Derriot Harbuck's essay on George Horne, later Dean of Canterbury, which teases out perhaps more fully than previous attempts the ways in which Horne's establishment orthodoxy found an elective affinity with John Hutchinson's scientific theories based on an idiosyncratic reading of the Hebrew Bible. George Westhaver's essay on William Jones of Nayland and E.B. Pusey shows in Knockolian fashion the Tractarian Pusey's use of, but departure from, his 18th century predecessor's theological method, and two essays by Kenneth Parker and James Pereiro on Henry Manning. Parker's brilliantly illuminating brilliantly illuminating Manning's journey from Anglican to Catholic, and I'll return to Pereiro at the end. Others shed light on the chronological hinterland of the Oxford movement, because if on one hand, Peter's own monograph offered a new interpretation of the Oxford movement, arguing in places for the radical novelty of what the Tractarians thought and did, his book was, to my mind, even more important for its portrayal of Anglicanism and religion more broadly in the period before 1833. And this collection takes this chronological context back to 1660, rather than Peter's own original starting point of 1760. And this is fit and proper, since after his doctoral monograph, Peter wrote much which shed light on the century before 1760, and his later publications on Newman and on 19th century views of the Reformation take him after 1857, enabling authors indeed to range from 1660 to 1900. Thus, Bill Gibson explores the court sermons delivered by Roman Catholic preachers in James II's newly constructed Catholic chapel at Whitehall. I don't think anyone has examined these as a group of texts before, and as such, they illuminate the role of the Catholic chapel in providing the theological arsenal of James's reign, which has implications for the long-standing debate about the balance between James's absolutism and tolerance. And Bill, I think, could have examined that a little more. Richard Sharp's wide-ranging essay on engraved clerical portraiture from 1660 to 1850, which ends just before photographs started to capture prominent clergy, is, while something of a whistle-stop, there's a whole book in this, Richard, is nevertheless a fantastic survey of styles and modes from engravings, mezzotints, and copperplates. The essay is also superbly illustrated, so you must get that discounted copy and look at these fantastic illustrations. The extraordinary lawn sleeves in the 1831 engraving of William van Mildert, last Prince Bishop of Durham, nearly rivaling the sleeves on the late Princess of Wales's wedding dress, are a telling insight into the depiction of the clerical establishment. And given time and space, it would have been great to have asked rather more about what these portraits tell us of images of clergy and the church in these 200 years. Nigel Aston's essay, as Nigel's already introduced it, on Thomas Townson explores high church continuities and connections in the Midlands, giving a regional focus to Peter's original context. The collection fittingly also reflects Peter's interests after his original research, which in themselves were shaped and formed directly as a result of his career at the John Rylands Library and quondam custodian of the Methodist collection, and Bill Simpson's already talked about that. Although there are a couple of references to John Wesley in Peter's 1994 monograph, I'm sure that the various essays he later wrote on John and Charles Wesley only happened because of his day job and because of his involvement in the supervision of a number of doctoral students at the University of Manchester, who, as Jordan has noted, explored early Methodism using the Rylands collections. And Jordan, of course, was one of those great scholars. And I think this is testimony to Peter's ability to see a seamless connection between his library work, his scholarship, and his research. Thus, Rachel Cope explores the ways in which Catherine Livingston Garrettson's reading helped her move from a solitary to a communal evangelical spirituality. And Carol Blessing, as we've just heard, uses primary sources at the John Rylands Library to examine the complex ways in which Fletcher's biography by Henry Moore de-radicalized her ideas, as well as minimizing the role of Mary Tooth. By placing the original sources against the printed text, Blessing demonstrates the silencing and constraining of Mary Fletcher's own views. David Bebbington offers a case study of Wesleyan Methodist spirituality in Brunswick Chapel, Leeds during the Victorian period, where priorities were conversion, biblicism, and activism, but where he notes that by 1900, piety was shallower. And Stuart J. Brown's illuminating essay on the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland in 1869 is an original study of the issues of church and state, taking some of the issues often studied within England to the very different Irish context. It's interesting that two essays, those by Andrew Crome and James Pereiro, examine attitudes to Jews, suggestive of the ways that the religion in the title of the book moves beyond a study of Christianity, whether Protestant or Catholic, and testimony that by the 19th century, other religions impacted on the British and Christian scene. Crome's essay focus is on the genre of evangelical novels about the conversion of individual Jews between 1820 and 1850, with novelists using this genre to critique both Catholicism and nonconformity, linking the conversion of the Jews to an Anglican evangelical establishment to a national restoration to Palestine. And Pereira's essay explores a hitherto almost unexamined topic of Cardinal Manning's interest in the Russian pogroms of the early 1880s and other contemporary Jewish issues. Many books have as their title something along the lines of religion in Britain. And I'm going to tease Bill by saying that he's written or edited several books using these very same or nearly same words. Nevertheless, this variant of that title contains essays which offer a particular and distinctive take on the history of religion between 1660 and 1900. And that take, in some ways unifying, in some ways eclectic, reflects the contribution, insights, scholarship, and influence of the person the book honors. Peter, this book is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, very much indeed. The image of William van Milderdt's lawn sleeves is one that I don't think I will be able to get out of my head after your comments, Jeremy. Now, at last, Peter, we get the opportunity to hear from you, because this is an opportunity for you to say what you think, and so it's over to you, Peter.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for this great honour, for me totally unexpected. And it has been mentioned, for the secret to be kept for 4 years was indeed remarkable. I had no sense at all, but it was bemusing that it was on April the 1st that Jordan broke the news to me, and it did momentarily go through my mind it might be an April Fool, but no, of course not. So unexpected, but delighted and thrilled. And the volume itself, which I've been reading with great interest, is wonderful. And I think what I particularly like is the balance of the library element and the scholarly element, integrating it. And as Jeremy rightly said, that sort of seamless link is important and not so easy to find these days, perhaps. And I'd be the first to admit mine has not been a normal, typical model career path. It wouldn't fit that model at all. But I've enjoyed doing what I'm doing, and many of the opportunities to write came, invitations, projects appeared. What I'm saying is that it wasn't particularly planned. But above all, I have to thank the Rylands and to thank Bill and others, and I'm thanking several people who are no longer sadly with us. Those early days at Rylands were important. I left Oxford, it was a wrench, and there were those who made me feel at home. I single out Dorothy Clayton as a long-standing friend from the library, and the late Peter McNiven, who were always very encouraging, and of course Bill himself. But also Clive Field, and it was an important moment really in 1990 when I moved to look after the Methodist collections, that it enabled that dovetailing of my ongoing research interests to get revived and go in a slightly new direction and be enriched. And I'd like to say that, well, you've mentioned what I brought, but you brought to me, you've stimulated me. It was working with scholars coming into those collections that, you know, it was a two-way process really. So I've got a lot to be thankful for there. Going back to the Oxford days, those early days, and Jeremy will remember, and John Walsh was a tremendous mentor, and obviously the late Geoffrey Rao, greatly missed, who supervised me. And before that, contact with David Newsom, who was one of my examiners along with John, and I owe them and Sheridan Gilly an awful lot, and others at a later stage in different contexts, like the late Ernest Nicholson at Oriel, Alan McClellan, Vincent Alan McClellan, Professor McClellan of the Catholic Record Society. All these were sources of encouragement and rocks of support, and I don't think I'd have felt, you know, because I was reluctant and shy and not always pushing myself forward, and they all encouraged me and helped me. And these openings, these institutions as well, I mean, the different projects. And also I should mention the late Colin Matthew. It was he who helped bring me into the Oxford University history in the 1980s and into the 90s. He already then had health issues, and that's how I took over that chapter. And then with the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, his work on that, and tragically was taken very suddenly from us over 20 years ago now. So there were people like that who I should remember today. And other institutions, well, the Pusey House, of course, they mentioned the Catholic Record Society, other societies, Ecclesiastical History Society, all these have given me a forum and opportunity to go on and to contribute. So it's been both the library, the support from the library and the librarians, support from encouragement of researchers, and the invitations to get involved in projects. Another one I've just forgotten about is the Canterbury Cathedral history and Margaret Sparks and how that happened, and the Fox project, David Loads and Mark Greengrass. So at various stages these have come on, and I've just sadly learned that Bill Speck passed away, but he was also another great supporter and influence, encouraged me to work on Robert Southey in context of Wesley. So it's a time to remember and think of all these people. I should also like to say that I'm not giving up, not hanging up the pen, and got various projects in the pipeline, 3 or 4 things. There's a history of ecumenism due out fairly soon, and so I hope to continue. And I'd also should mention the Manchester Wesley Research Centre, the Nazarene College, the great support and help and encouragement they've provided. Peter Ray and Deirdre and Jordan himself and everybody there. So I think really that goes back to 20 years really. So I'd like to pay tribute to them. And other continental scholars, like lovely to see Anders there from Sweden and Francois from France, and from America, Carol and Arlene. And to see some of you who have not met and others who I haven't seen for a long time, all on the screen here is great. So thank you all, and not the end of it. And I'm very, very touched, very moved. I think that's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Peter. And we're pleased that you're not hanging up your hat yet. And we have more to look forward to in the future from your pen. So all that really remains is for Bill and I to give a final thank you.